My name is Leona Carter. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the day my life shattered, only to be rebuilt by something I never saw coming. I sat on a cold wooden bench outside Vanderbilt University Hospital, my hands clasped so tightly together that my knuckles had turned bone white. The spring air was supposed to feel soft and alive, carrying the faint perfume of blooming dogwoods and the warmth of sunlight dancing on glass windows. But to me it felt like a cruel joke. Nature blooming while my husband was lying behind those walls, hooked up to machines fighting for his life. People passed me on the walkway, chatting about dinner plans, laughing about work gossip, their lives unbroken and untouched. I wanted to step into their conversations, borrow their normalcy for just a moment, pretend I wasn't the woman whose life had been hijacked by a hospital room and a diagnosis with a name that still felt foreign on my tongue. Autoimmunoplastic anemia. A disease so rare the doctors had to repeat themselves before it registered. 6 months ago Daniel was fine, or at least that's what we thought. We were talking about taking a trip to Savannah in the fall, maybe buying a bigger house, finally getting that dog we'd been joking about for years. Then he came home one evening looking pale, swearing it was just a long day at the workshop. He built custom furniture for a living, a man who could spend 12 hours bent over wood and still walk into the kitchen with enough energy to cook for both of us. That night, he tried to smile, but his eyes were clouded with a fatigue I'd never seen before. The tiredness didn't go away. It deepened, settled into his bones, and started showing itself in bruises he couldn't explain. Then came the night he woke up gasping for air, his skin damp with sweat, clutching his chest like every breath was a fight. That was the night I knew we couldn't wait. The nurse in me wanted to believe it was something manageable, something fixable. But deep down I already sensed that this was going to be bigger than us. The specialist's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. The doctor's voice was calm, his eyes heavy with the kind of sympathy that comes when you've had to deliver bad news too many times. "Your bone marrow is shutting down," he told Daniel. "Without a transplant, your body can't produce the blood cells you need to survive. The best donor is a sibling or close relative." The words barely left his mouth before the truth crashed over me. Daniel had no family. He'd grown up in foster care, abandoned as a newborn, and had spent his entire life wondering if there was someone out there with his eyes, his laugh, his stubborn half-smile. He never found them. Now that emptiness was no longer just emotional, it was life-threatening. We registered with the National Donor Registry immediately, but the doctors didn't sugarcoat it. Finding a match could take months, maybe longer, and Daniel didn't have that kind of time. Every day he got weaker. His hands trembled when he lifted a glass. His once strong frame thinned until I could see the outline of his collarbone through his hospital gown. Still, he tried to make me laugh, telling bad jokes about hospital food and teasing me about my worry wrinkles. He prayed at night when he thought I was asleep, asking not for his own strength but for mine. I tried to be strong. I told myself I'd prepare for the worst, but how do you prepare to lose the person who's your home? I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I thought I'd already faced the hardest truth. But then life threw me something unexpected. Not relief, not yet, but a thread of hope I never saw coming. That afternoon, after yet another closed-door conversation with his doctor, this one ending with the quiet, devastating phrase, "We're running out of options," I stepped outside into the hospital courtyard to catch my breath. I just needed a moment where I didn't have to hold my body together so tightly, where the air didn't smell like bleach and despair. That's when I heard it. 2 hospital employees sat on a bench nearby, their voices casual, unaware I was listening. One of them said, "You know that guy in ICU, Carter? He looks just like this guy from Pine Hollow." I swear it's like looking at the same person. The words hit me like a jolt of electricity. Pine Hollow, a small mountain town just a couple of hours away. I'd been there once during nursing school for a community outreach program. I remembered it as quiet, almost untouched, where people still waved at strangers and life moved slower. Could have been a coincidence. People look alike all the time. But the way my heart reacted, the way my pulse thudded in my ears, told me this was something else. Something important. Daniel had spent his life wondering if he had family, always too afraid to look for them. And now, in this moment when we needed it most, someone had just told me there might be a man out there who looked exactly like him. For the first time in weeks, I felt something fragile and terrifying, hope. That night I barely slept. I sat at Daniel's bedside, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, feeling the heat of his skin under my fingers. His face was pale, but in the faint light of the room, I saw traces of the man I fell in love with, the one who brought me wildflowers wrapped in butcher paper, who stayed up late sanding floors just so I'd wake up to a finished room, who told me more than once, "You are my family." I whispered to him then, a promise I wasn't sure I could keep but needed to make anyway. "I'm going to fix this, Danny. I don't care what it takes." I didn't sleep the night I overheard the nurses. Sleep felt like a luxury people with ordinary problems could afford. I sat up in the plastic recliner by Daniel's bed, counting the seconds between the rhythmic blips on the monitor and the soft whistle of his breath. Each rise and fall of his chest felt like a negotiation with the universe. I watched the shadows gathering in the corner of the room as the sky lightened to a dull blue-gray, and I made a decision before the first shift change. I was going to Pine Hollow. I didn't know the man's name, didn't have a plan beyond a stranger's resemblance and a town I barely remembered, but the choice lifted something heavy off my chest. Hope is painful, but it's lighter than despair. Before sunrise, I slipped home to shower and change, just long enough to stop smelling like antiseptic and hospital coffee. In the mirror, the woman staring back looked older than 34. Salt of worry at the hairline, eyes swollen from nights of quiet crying. I pressed my palm to the glass, steadied my breath, and pulled on a pair of jeans, a thick cardigan, and the locket Daniel bought me our first Christmas. When I got back to the ward, the night nurse raised an eyebrow at the sight of my overnight bag. "You going somewhere?" she asked, not unkindly. "I need to take emergency leave," I said. "Just one day to start. Maybe two." She knew about Daniel. Everyone did. Pity had a way of softening voices and filling silences around us. "Go talk to Charge," she murmured. "I'll keep an eye on him." I found my supervisor, Maritza, by the medication room typing into a chart with the kind of brisk determination of someone trying to keep a ship from sinking. When she saw me, her face gentled. "Leona, how's he doing?" "Not great." I swallowed. "I need to go out of town. There's a lead on a potential relative. Someone in Pine Hollow. It might be nothing, but it might be," my voice buckled. "It might be something." Maritza didn't ask for proof. She didn't tell me to be realistic. She stepped forward and hugged me so tightly I felt the damp warmth of her cheek on my temple. "Take it," she said into my hair. "Text me from the road. I'll run interference with staffing. Your shifts are covered." I thanked her and went back to Daniel's room to say goodbye. He was awake, propped up against pillows, skin the color of paper beneath that stubborn flush he always tried to muster when he saw me. "You look like you're about to fix a whole hospital," he joked, voice rough with fatigue. "Just a small part of it," I said, brushing his hair off his forehead. I thought about telling him everything, about Pine Hollow, about the stranger who might be family, but fear pressed a hand over my mouth. If it turned out to be nothing, I would be the one who put false light in his eyes. I kissed him instead. "I'll be gone a few hours. Maybe longer. Rest. Please." He searched my face for the truth I wasn't ready to say. He had always been able to read me, as if all my secrets were written in a language only he understood. "Be safe," he said finally. "I'll be here." The road east out of Nashville peeled away from the city in wide concrete ribbons before narrowing into two lanes that snaked through hills shouldered by pines and bare oaks just beginning to silver with buds. Spring rain hovered like a veil, too fine to wipe, too steady to ignore, so the world blurred at the edges. I drove with both hands on the wheel, and my jaw locked to keep my mind from galloping. Every few miles, I'd catch a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror and the locket winking at my throat, and I'd whisper, "Hold on, Danny. Hold on." Pine Hollow announced itself not with a sign, but with a feeling. The way the road thinned, the houses spread out, and the horizon opened to fields tufted with last season's corn stubble. I crossed a wooden bridge I remembered from nursing school outreach visits, its timbers groaning under the tires, and rolled past a row of clapboard houses that leaned into their porches as if tired from standing all winter. The town center was modest. A general store with a faded Coca-Cola mural, a diner whose windows fogged with the breath of breakfast, a barbershop pole spinning slowly in the damp. I parked outside the general store and pushed open the door to a bell that chimed like a memory. The air smelled like coffee grounds, leather, and rain-soaked wood. A man in his 50s stood behind the counter, glasses low on his nose, a crossword spread in front of him like a challenge he intended to win. He glanced up with practiced caution, the way small-town clerks look at strangers, measuring their reason for being there. "Morning," he said. "Morning." I took a breath. "I'm looking for someone, and I'm hoping you might point me in the right direction." I pulled out my phone, hands suddenly clumsy, and brought up a photo of Daniel from last summer. Sunburned, grinning, a streak of sawdust on his t-shirt. I held it out. "Has anyone around here ever looked like him?" The clerk drew the photo closer, squinted, and then his eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. "Luke." My heart flung itself against my ribs. "Luke. Luke Henderson." The man gestured toward the window, as if the name itself had a direction. "County Road 6, about 10 minutes out." Tall boy, broad like a barn door. "Those eyes, though." He tapped his own temple. "Same eyes. Do you know if he's in today? Unless the rain chased him to the diner, he'll be at his place. Doesn't take to town much when he doesn't have to." The clerk seemed to think better of something and added, "Luke's decent. Quiet. Keeps to himself since his mama passed. You're not here to cause trouble, are you?" I shook my head so quickly I felt a pinch in my neck. "No. My husband is in the hospital. He needs a transplant. We don't have family." I heard someone mention a man in Pine Hollow who looked like him, and I swallowed the word desperate before it slipped out. I had to try. The clerk's face softened in the way you see in people who've known enough hard years to recognize them in others. He sketched a map on the back of a receipt. "Out past the church, turn right at the rusted mailboxes, left where the fence breaks, keep going until the road thinks about giving up." He said it like a joke, but I understood. I tucked the directions into my pocket, thanked him with a sincerity I couldn't fully express, and stepped back into the drizzle. County Road 6 turned quickly from asphalt to patched concrete, then to gravel that pinged and popped under the tires. The fields on either side lay quiet, threaded with small streams swollen by rain. When I finally spotted a mailbox with Henderson stenciled in ghostly white, my fingers went numb around the steering wheel. The house beyond it was tired but stubborn, clapboard gone gray with weather, windows winking dull light. A rusted swing moved in the wind, creaking a rhythm that made the whole place feel like it was breathing. A dog barked as I pulled up, deep territorial. I froze halfway out of the car until a man appeared on the porch and gave a short whistle. The dog quieted with a low grumble and retreated to the shadows. And then I really saw the man. He was taller than Daniel by an inch or two, shoulders broad beneath a work jacket, hands braced on the porch rail like he'd spent a lifetime lifting things heavier than himself. Streaks of dark blonde hair fell across his forehead in a way that seemed careless rather than styled. But it was his eyes that stopped me. The startling glacial blue I knew better than my own reflection. The same shape. The same slight squint when focusing on a person. The same Daniel-ness that made my skin prickle with recognition I hadn't earned. He didn't move closer. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice low and wary. "My name is Leona," I said, stepping forward into the rain so he could see me clearly, so I didn't feel like a ghost calling up to a house that belonged to another life. "Leona Carter." This is going to sound strange. I held up my phone with the photo again. "This is my husband. His name is Daniel Carter. He's very sick. Someone at the hospital said you looked like him, and my voice thinned to a thread. I had to come." He didn't take the phone right away, as if the act of reaching for it might make the thing irrevocably real. Then he leaned down, squinting against the drizzle, and stared at Daniel's face like he was reading a map that led somewhere he'd never dared go. His throat worked once. Twice. "Huh," he said, but the sound was weighted like a word with missing pieces. He dragged a hand over his mouth. "I'll be damned." Silence filled the space between us until it ached. He looked up. The guardedness in his posture hadn't disappeared, but something else had broken through, surprise certainly. And something like longing, if longing could look like a muscle flinching after it's been numb too long. "I'm Luke," he said at last. "Luke Henderson." Inside the house, the air was warmer than outside, smelling faintly of coffee, wet wool, and motor oil. A mug sat abandoned on the table next to a dog-eared copy of a hunting almanac. He gestured at a chair and I sat, hands clasped tight in my lap, the damp hem of my cardigan leaking cold onto my skin. Luke took the chair opposite, leaned forward, and set his elbows on his knees the way men do when they've braced themselves for a hit. "Tell me," he said. I told him everything I could in a voice that tried and failed to stay steady. The fatigue, the bruises, the diagnosis that cut the floor from under us, the registry, the waiting that wasn't really waiting so much as watching a clock run out. I told him about overhearing the nurses in the courtyard, about the way the word Pine Hollow had sounded like a door unlocking in my chest. I didn't ask him for anything yet. I simply laid the truth between us like a piece of wood he could choose to pick up or leave where it lay. He listened without interrupting, jaw tightening and loosening, eyes moving back to the photo on my phone as if he needed proof that this conversation belonged to his life. When I finished, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a full count of 5. Then he said, "My mother wasn't much of a mother." The flatness in his tone told me that sentence contained 1,000 unspoken memories. Had kids with different men. Some stayed a while. Most didn't. When I was little, she had a boy. I remember because I wanted to name him after a baseball player and she laughed. A week later, he was gone. He looked at me. She said she signed papers at the hospital and left him. I never knew more than that. Never knew where he went. Sometimes I thought I made him up because wanting something that bad can make a lie feel like it might be true. The room tilted. Relief and grief tangled in my stomach. His birth records were sealed. He grew up in foster care. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. He told me that once that family is what you build, but he always wondered. I realized my hands were shaking and folded them tighter. "Luke, we can do testing today. Blood draw HLA typing. If you're a match." I didn't finish. The word "if" sat between us like a dare neither of us had the right to make. Luke didn't hesitate. He stood so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. "What do you need me to do?" Took me a second to reorient. We aren't trained for people to say yes without bargaining. There are risks to donation," I began, the nurse in me surfacing even as the wife clutched at hope. "It's safe, but there's discomfort. Time off work. We'll need to screen you for." "Leona." He said my name like a hand on my shoulder. "If he's my brother, I'm doing it. If he isn't, I'm still doing the test so we'll know. Either way, I'm not letting you drive back to Nashville with nothing but rain for company." Something inside me unclenched with a sob I swallowed before it reached daylight. "Thank you," I managed. "I can call the transplant coordinator on the way. They'll fast-track it given Daniel's status." I pulled out my phone and dialed, adrenaline rippling through my fingers as I paced the small kitchen with its mismatched linoleum and a calendar 3 months behind. When the coordinator answered, I introduced Luke with a steadiness I didn't feel. We had labs waiting. We had order sets primed for emergency matches. As I rattled off DOBs and MRNs, Luke grabbed a jacket, scribbled a note he stuck under a magnet on the fridge. "Gone to Nashville. Back soon." And whistled for the dog, who rose, stretched, and laid back down with a huff as if to say, "You two go save a life. I'll guard the house." We took separate vehicles. I didn't ask why he insisted. Maybe he needed the ritual of driving his own truck on a road that might be the most important he'd ever take. The rain thickened to a steady drum that turned the world monochrome. I kept him in my rear view like a promise. On a straightaway lined with pines, my phone buzzed. A text from Maritza. "How's it going?" I sent back a photo through the windshield, the blur of a pickup in the mirror, and typed "Found someone. Testing today." She responded with a prayer hands emoji and a drive safe. And for once I didn't mind the shorthand of hope. By the time Vanderbilt's glass facade rose up like a ship in the mist, my heart was sprinting. I led Luke through the maze of corridors that I could navigate blindfolded, introduced him to the coordinator, signed forms, expedited labs. People moved with that clipped urgency that happens when the stakes are both obvious and personal. While they drew Luke's blood, I stood in the hallway with my shoulder against the cool wall and stared at the clock above the nurse's station, willing the hands to circle faster, to cheat time without breaking it. After, I brought him to Daniel's floor. I paused at the door, sudden terror flooding me. What if they weren't a match? What if I'd brought a mirage into a desert? What if the sight of a face with his eyes broke something in Daniel we couldn't put back together? I touched the locket at my throat like an old superstition and breathed. "Ready?" Luke asked, voice gentler than it had been. as if he understood that stepping over this threshold changed not just paths but entire maps. I nodded and pushed the door open. Daniel looked up. For a moment, time folded, past into present, hope into fear, until everything sharpened into one astonishing point: recognition. His eyes widened, then filled, and I watched two versions of the same gaze meet across a narrow hospital room washed in the soft beep of machines. Daniel's hand, thin and bruised, lifted off the blanket like a question. Luke stepped forward, then another step, until the distance between them was small enough to answer. Luke didn't rush the space between them. He stopped just close enough for the air to feel different, for the weight of their eyes to pull the rest of the world out of focus. Daniel's hand hung there for a second, trembling not just from weakness but from something deeper. Uncertainty, disbelief, maybe even fear that if he reached out, the man in front of him would vanish like a dream. But Luke reached first. He wrapped his hand around Daniel's with a firmness that was careful, deliberate, like holding something fragile that had somehow survived a storm. Daniel let out a shaky laugh that was half sob. You look like me," he whispered. Luke's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile but held the same warmth. "Guess that makes sense. I think I'm your brother." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. I saw his chest rise too quickly, his fingers tighten on Luke's, his lips part as if to say something, but all he managed was a hoarse, "Brother," before the tears slipped free. I stepped closer, resting my hand on Daniel's shoulder, feeling the tremor running through him. Luke pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat, never letting go of Daniel's hand. "Our mother. She had you when I was just a kid. Told me she wasn't keeping you. I didn't understand at the time, just knew one day there was a baby and the next day there wasn't. I never forgot. Always wondered what happened." Daniel blinked at him like he was trying to take in a lifetime in a single moment. "I spent years wondering if I had someone out there. Someone who might have wanted me." His voice broke on that last part, and I had to look away for a second, the lump in my throat making it hard to breathe. "You got me," Luke said simply. "And I'm here now. That's what matters." Daniel let out a shaky breath and then, almost as if he was afraid to ask, "Why are you here now?" Luke glanced at me and I knew it was my cue. "Because," I said softly, "he's willing to be tested as a donor. And if we're lucky, if we're very, very lucky, he might be your match." Daniel's gaze swung back to Luke, and something in his eyes shifted, from shock to hope, though he seemed afraid to let it grow. "You do that? For me?" "Daniel," Luke said, leaning in just slightly, "if you are my brother, then we've already lost enough time. I'm not losing you too." The rest of the day blurred into a series of moments that felt suspended between dread and possibility. The transplant team moved quickly, whisking Luke away for the remainder of the compatibility tests. The coordinator explained the process again: blood typing, HLA matching, infectious disease screening, and Luke signed the consent forms without hesitation. In the waiting room, I sat with Daniel, watching him stare at the door Luke had walked through. His fingers picked absently at the edge of his blanket, and I could see his mind chasing 100 thoughts at once. "Talk to me," I urged gently. He looked at me with eyes that were red but shining. "Leona, all these years I told myself I was fine not knowing, that I didn't need anyone but you. And now," he paused, swallowing hard, "now I'm scared that if he's not a match, I'll lose more than just a chance at living. I'll lose him too." I took his hand, threading my fingers through his. "Listen to me. Whatever the results say, you've found your brother. That's something no lab test can take away. Do you understand?" He nodded, though the worry in his gaze didn't fade entirely. I knew it wouldn't, not until the results came back. The hours crawled by, marked only by the occasional footsteps of nurses and the soft hum of hospital equipment. Finally, the transplant coordinator stepped into the room, a folder in her hands and a smile that told me before she even spoke. "He's a strong match," she said. "One of the best we've seen in a long time." For a second I couldn't speak. My vision blurred and my knees threatened to give way. I turned to Daniel, squeezing his hand so tightly I worried I might hurt him. "Did you hear that? He's a match." Daniel's head fell back against the pillows, a sound escaping him that was half laugh, half sob. His free hand covered his face, and when he lowered it again, he was smiling weakly but genuinely, for the first time in weeks. Luke appeared in the doorway, still in his street clothes but with a yellow hospital wristband around his arm. He leaned on the frame and gave a lopsided grin. "So when do we start?" The coordinator explained the next steps: scheduling the procedure, prepping Daniel for the transplant, and giving Luke the information he'd need for his part. Luke just nodded along as if none of it fazed him. "Guess we better get to it," he said, looking between us. "Time's not exactly something we can waste." Daniel reached for his brother's hand again, gripping it with a strength I hadn't seen in weeks. "You just gave me more time than I thought I'd ever have," he whispered. Luke squeezed back, his voice steady but soft. "Then let's make sure we use it." That night, as the hospital quieted and the city lights shimmered beyond the window, I sat between the two of them, my husband, pale but smiling, and the brother he never knew he had, steady and solid by his side. For the first time in months, the air didn't feel so heavy. The fear was still there, but it was threaded through with something else now. Something strong enough to hold it back. Hope. The night before the transplant felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. The hospital floor was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that makes every distant sound, footsteps at the nurse's station, the soft click of a medication cart, feel amplified. I sat in the recliner beside Daniel's bed, my knees drawn up, watching him sleep. His breathing was steady, but his face looked younger somehow, like the tension he'd been carrying for months had softened for just a moment. Across the room, Luke was slouched in a visitor chair, long legs stretched out, arms crossed over his chest. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were fixed on Daniel as if memorizing his face. I realized then that in less than 12 hours, Luke would be in one operating room and Daniel in another, their bodies linked by something neither of them had ever planned for but both desperately needed. "Can't sleep," I whispered. Luke's gaze flicked to me, then back to his brother. "Not really." He paused as if weighing his words. "It's strange. I didn't know him yesterday and now," his voice tightened. "Now it feels like I've known him my whole life. And I can't stop thinking about how close I came to never walking into this building." I swallowed the lump in my throat. I can't stop thinking about how close I came to losing him. Luke leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "We're not gonna let that happen." The way he said it, steady like a promise carved into stone, made me believe it, at least for that moment. The morning came too soon. Nurses bustled in before sunrise, checking vitals, hanging 4 fluids and confirming paperwork. The transplant coordinator arrived with 2 separate teams, one for Luke's bone marrow harvest, the other for Daniel's infusion prep. I watched the controlled chaos unfold, my stomach twisting tighter with every passing minute. Daniel was awake now, his eyes following the activity. When a nurse adjusted his blanket, he caught my hand and held it firmly. "Leona," he murmured, "I'm scared." I bent closer, brushing my fingers through his hair. "I know. I am too. But this is our chance, Danny. You fought so hard to get here. Let's see it through." Luke stepped up to the bedside, dressed in a pale blue hospital gown over his jeans. "Hey," he said, his voice low but warm. "I've got you, all right? You just focus on getting better. Let me do my part." Daniel studied him for a long moment, then said something so soft I almost didn't hear it. "You're already doing more than I ever thought anyone would." The staff wheeled Luke out first, heading toward the surgical suite where they'd extract the marrow from his pelvic bone under anesthesia. He gave a quick nod toward Daniel before disappearing through the doors. I knew what awaited him: hours of lying face down, the surgeons drawing the rich, red marrow that could restart my husband's failing body. Then it was Daniel's turn. They didn't take him to an operating room. His part would happen here in his hospital bed as an infusion. But he needed central line access and a battery of pre-medications to reduce the risk of complications. I stayed by his side as they started the 4 antihistamines and steroids, the scent of alcohol swabs sharp in the air. "Feels like I'm about to get superpowers," Daniel joked weakly as the nurse hung a bag of saline. "You already have them," I said, squeezing his hand. "You've just been hiding them under all that stubbornness." When the moment finally came, the nurse wheeled in a small cooler. Inside, in a clear blood bag, was Luke's marrow, a deep, vibrant red that seemed impossibly alive. The sight of it made my breath catch. That color meant possibility. It meant hope in its most tangible form. The nurse hung the bag on the 4-pole, connected the tubing to Daniel's central line, and with a steady hand opened the clamp. The marrow began to flow. I watched it travel down the line, watched it enter his body, and I thought about how life could move through such small, fragile channels. Daniel closed his eyes, his face calm, and I felt the room shift, not in sound or light, but in the quiet gravity of what was happening. It took a little over an hour for the infusion to finish. When the nurse removed the tubing and secured the line, Daniel opened his eyes and looked at me. "It's in," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "It's in," I echoed, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe we might actually have a future beyond hospital walls. Later that afternoon, Luke was wheeled back to the room, groggy but smiling faintly despite the soreness I knew he must be feeling. Daniel reached for his arm, and they clasped hands again, no words needed. Everything worth saying had already been exchanged in that grip. "You just gave me a second chance," Daniel whispered. Luke's lips curved into a tired smile. "Guess we're even now. You gave me family." I turned toward the window, blinking back tears. The city stretched beyond the glass, unknowing and unchanged. But inside this small hospital room, something monumental had shifted. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We had started to win. The first 24 hours after the transplant felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Every step forward carried hope, but one wrong move could plunge us into the unknown. The infusion itself was over, but the real battle had just begun. The doctors explained it in clinical terms: engraftment. Luke's stem cells would need to travel through Daniel's bloodstream, find their way into his bone marrow, and begin producing healthy blood cells. Could take weeks. And in those weeks, anything could happen. Daniel's immune system had been intentionally wiped out to make room for Luke's cells, which meant he had no defenses at all. Every visitor had to scrub in, mask up, and stay a careful distance unless absolutely necessary. Even I had to wear gloves when I touched him. It felt unnatural, like loving him through a barrier. Luke returned to the hospital the next morning, moving slower than before. I could see the stiffness in the way he sat down, the way he shifted in the chair to ease the soreness in his lower back. The harvest procedure might have been routine for the surgical team, but for him it had left bruises deep in the muscle, a dull ache he wouldn't talk about unless I pressed. "You don't have to be here every day," I told him gently. "You should rest." Luke gave me a look that reminded me so much of Daniel when he'd made up his mind about something. Rest? While he's in here. Not happening. And he kept his word. Every day, Luke sat in that same visitor chair, sometimes talking with Daniel when he was awake, sometimes just reading an old paperback in silence. When Daniel dozed off, Luke would glance at him like he was checking to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still his to protect. The doctors came in twice a day, scanning lab results and monitoring Daniel's counts. "No fevers, no signs of infection," one of them said on the third morning, his tone cautiously optimistic. "This is exactly what we want to see." Daniel managed a small smile, though he still tired easily. "Guess my brother makes good marrow," he murmured, glancing at Luke. Luke chuckled. "Best in Pine Hollow." Those little exchanges, light, easy, almost normal, were worth more than any test result to me. They were proof that some part of Daniel was coming back, not just in body but in spirit. One afternoon, I brought Luke a coffee from the cafe downstairs. He was standing by the window, watching the city skyline fade into the hazy spring afternoon. "You okay?" I asked, handing him the cup. He nodded, but his eyes stayed on the horizon. "I've spent most of my life thinking I didn't matter to anyone beyond the people I worked for. No family. No ties. And now," he took a sip, his voice rough, "now I've got a brother in there who needs me, and a sister-in-law who drove 2 hours in the rain to find me. It's a lot." I stood beside him, my hand brushing his arm. "You matter more than you know, Luke. You didn't just save Daniel's life. You gave him something he's wanted his whole life. Someone who shares his blood. That's not just medicine. That's everything." For a moment we both just stood there, looking out at the city like it might hold the answers to all the questions we hadn't asked yet. Back in the room, Daniel was awake and watching us. "You two planning my welcome home party without me?" he teased, his voice still soft but carrying that familiar spark. "Only the important details," Luke shot back. "Like making sure you do all the cooking." Daniel rolled his eyes, but there was a warmth there I hadn't seen in months. It was in the way he looked at Luke now, not just as a match, not just as a savior, but as someone who belonged in his life. That night, as Daniel drifted off, I saw Luke reach out and adjust the blanket over his brother's chest without saying a word. His movements were careful, almost reverent, like he knew the weight of what he'd just helped give back. I realized then that whatever happened in the days ahead, whatever setbacks or scares might come, we weren't alone anymore. We had a new kind of family, forged not by years of shared memories but by a single life-altering choice. And in the quiet of that hospital room, I let myself believe that it might just be enough to carry us through. The first sign that things might truly be turning around came on the 7th morning after the transplant. I had been sitting in the recliner all night, lulled into a half-sleep by the beeping of the monitors, when a soft voice broke through the haze. "Leona," Daniel whispered. My eyes snapped open. He was looking at me with that lopsided smile I'd been aching to see again, the one that tilted more on the right when he was trying not to laugh. "What is it?" I asked, moving closer. "I'm hungry." It was the most ordinary sentence in the world, but to me it was a miracle. For weeks, his appetite had been nearly gone, every meal a battle I had to coax him through. Now, hearing him say it without me prompting felt like a crack in the clouds. I helped him sit up, tucking pillows behind him. He took the spoon from my hand when breakfast arrived, oatmeal, scrambled eggs, a cup of apple juice, and fed himself. His hands trembled slightly, but he finished half the tray before leaning back with a satisfied sigh. Luke walked in just then, a brown paper bag in hand. "Brought you something better than hospital food," he said, holding it up. "Cinnamon rolls from that bakery down the street." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Now you're speaking my language." It wasn't much, just a sticky bun dusted with powdered sugar, but watching him take a bite, I saw a flicker of the man who used to spend Saturday mornings making pancakes from scratch, who'd always insist on eating them on the porch even if it was chilly. The doctors came in mid-morning with his latest lab results. "Your white count is up," Dr. Patel said, flipping through the chart. "That means Luke's cells are engrafting. We're heading in the right direction." Luke grinned, clapping his brother gently on the shoulder. "Told you I've got good marrow." Daniel's smile was tired but genuine. "Yeah, guess I lucked out twice. Once finding her," he nodded toward me, "and once finding you." I swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting in my eyes. Later, while Daniel napped, Luke and I slipped down to the hospital cafe for coffee. We sat at a table by the window, the rain from last night still clinging to the glass in scattered droplets. "I haven't told you much about my life," Luke began, stirring sugar into his cup without looking at me. "You don't have to," I said gently. "I want to." He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "After our mom left him at the hospital, I stayed with her for a while. But she wasn't exactly stable. I bounced between relatives and family friends until I was old enough to get out on my own. Worked odd jobs, saved what I could. Ended up in Pine Hollow because it was quiet and cheap." He gave a short laugh. "Guess I figured if I didn't have family, at least I'd have peace." I listened without interrupting, sensing how much it cost him to pull up those memories. "When I saw Daniel's picture," he continued, "I thought maybe it was a trick. Or maybe I was just seeing what I wanted to see. But when you told me about his life, it felt like a missing piece clicked into place." He shook his head. "If I'd known sooner." I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "You're here now. That's what matters." He nodded, his jaw tightening as he swallowed whatever emotion was threatening to surface. When we got back to the room, Daniel was awake, flipping through a woodworking magazine I'd brought from home. He looked up, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "So Luke," he said, "when I'm out of here, think you could help me build a dining table? Been wanting to replace ours for years." Luke smirked. "As long as you do the sanding." I hate sanding. The banter was easy now, almost natural, as though they'd been ribbing each other for decades instead of days. Watching them, I felt a quiet shift, like something fragile had grown roots. But that night after Luke left, I found something that made my stomach knot. I had gone down to the hospital pharmacy to pick up one of Daniel's prescriptions, and while waiting for the elevator back to his floor, I overheard two staff members talking. "Did you hear about that man from Pine Hollow?" one said. "The one who's donating marrow?" Word is he's got some kind of legal trouble back home. Yeah, the other replied. Something about a property dispute. And maybe an assault charge? I froze, the words settling in my chest like ice. I didn't know if it was gossip, exaggeration, or the truth, but it was about Luke. And suddenly, the ground under my feet didn't feel as steady as it had this morning. I couldn't shake the words I'd overheard in the elevator. Even as I walked back to Daniel's room, prescription bag in hand, my mind spun in tight, anxious circles. Property dispute. Assault charge. The phrases clung to me like burrs, each step I took making them dig in deeper. When I reached his room, Daniel was awake, talking quietly with Luke, who'd returned while I was gone. They both looked up when I came in. Everything okay? Daniel asked, noticing my expression. I forced a smile I didn't feel. Yeah, just took a while downstairs. Luke was perched in his usual spot by the bed. His posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. There was something about him that had always felt steady to me since we'd met. Like a man who knew exactly where he stood in the world. Even if the ground under him wasn't perfect. But now I wondered if I'd been blinded by gratitude, by the miracle he'd given us. I set Daniel's medication on the counter, pretending to check the dosage while my thoughts tangled. Should I confront Luke right here? Wait until Daniel was asleep? Or say nothing at all until I knew for sure? Daniel yawned, shifting down into his pillows. I think I'm going to rest for a bit, he murmured. Luke stood, stretching his shoulders. I'll head down to grab a coffee. I seized the moment. Luke, can we talk? Outside. He gave me a curious look but followed me into the hallway. We stopped near the window at the end of the corridor, the evening light spilling pale and gold across the floor. What's going on? He asked, his voice low. I took a breath, my pulse loud in my ears. I overheard something. Some of the hospital staff, they were talking about you. About Pine Hollow. They said you might have some legal trouble back home. A property dispute. And maybe an assault charge. His jaw tightened and for a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. So it's made it all the way here, huh? Is it true? I pressed. He looked at me then, not angry but tired. Yes and no. There was a fight. And it got messy. I folded my arms. Messy how? He leaned against the wall, his gaze distant. There's this piece of land, my grandparents' old property. I've been taking care of it for years, paying the taxes, keeping it up. Then some developer comes along claiming he bought it from my uncle, who's been living in Florida for decades. I told him to get lost. He didn't. We argued. He got in my face, shoved me, and I shoved back. He tripped over a pile of boards. Broke his wrist. I studied his face, trying to read the truth in it. They called the cops. He pressed charges. The DA's still deciding what to do. But my lawyer thinks it's just a matter of paying the medical bills. I didn't assault him. I defended myself. But small towns have long memories, and now half of Pine Hollow thinks I'm some kind of thug. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease, but not completely. Why didn't you tell us? He shrugged. Because it doesn't change what I came here to do. And I didn't want Daniel worrying about me when he's got enough to fight already. There was a quiet sincerity in his voice that made it hard to stay suspicious. Still, I knew that once Daniel found out, and he'd have questions. Back in the room, Daniel was awake again, his gaze drifting between us as we walked in. Everything all right? He asked. Yeah, Luke said easily, taking his seat again. Just getting some fresh air. Daniel smiled faintly. Good. I want you both here tonight. Feels better when you're close. And so we stayed. Luke pulled his chair closer to the bed, and I settled back into the recliner. As the night deepened, the three of us fell into an easy silence. The steady beep of the monitor and the hum of the 4-pump the only sounds in the room. At one point I looked over and saw Daniel and Luke holding a quiet conversation, voices too low for me to make out. But the expression on Daniel's face told me enough: trust. Real unguarded trust. And for the first time since I'd overheard those nurses, I wondered if maybe that was all that really mattered right now. Daniel's progress in the days that followed felt like a series of cautious steps across a bridge we weren't sure would hold. His appetite returned in bursts. One day he'd clear half his lunch tray, the next he'd barely touch a cup of broth. His voice grew stronger, his color better, and the lab report showed his counts creeping upward. Every morning, Dr. Patel would appear with that careful, tempered optimism that kept us tethered to hope without letting us drift into overconfidence. But in the back of my mind, the reality never left. Recovery after a bone marrow transplant wasn't a straight climb. It was a narrow path with room for sudden drops. The first sign of trouble came late one afternoon. Daniel had been sitting up in bed, reading a magazine Luke brought him, when I noticed the faintest sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Hey," I said, touching the back of his neck. His skin was hot. Too hot. "Are you feeling okay?" He gave a small shrug like he didn't want to make a big deal of it. "Bit warm. Probably just the room." Luke looked up sharply. "You're flushed." I grabbed the thermometer from the counter, slid it under his tongue, and watched the seconds tick by. When it beeped, the number made my stomach sink. 101.8 degrees Fahrenheit. I hit the call button. Within minutes, the nurses were there, checking his vitals, drawing blood cultures, starting broad-spectrum antibiotics. Dr. Patel arrived not long after, his expression serious. "Post-transplant fevers are always a concern," he explained. "Could be infection, could be graft-versus-host disease. We'll know more once the labs come back." The words landed like stones in my chest. Infection was dangerous enough, but graft-versus-host disease, Luke's immune cells attacking Daniel's body, could undo everything we'd fought for. They moved Daniel to a monitored isolation room, sealing the door behind us. Luke and I scrubbed in and put on gowns before we could enter. Inside, Daniel looked at us both with that stubborn half-smile, like he knew we were on the edge of panic and was trying to pull us back. "Hey," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere. You two worry too much." "You're not making it easy not to," I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. Luke pulled his chair up to the bed, leaning forward on his knees. "Listen to me," he said quietly. "You've got my marrow in you now. That stubborn marrow. It's not going to quit." Daniel chuckled weakly, but his eyes softened in a way that told me he was holding on to Luke's words like a lifeline. The night dragged. Nurses came and went in soft-soled shoes, checking lines, taking vitals. The beeps of the monitor became a background hum, constant and unnerving. I sat by Daniel's bed, my hand wrapped around his, while Luke kept vigil in the corner chair. His long frame folded in on itself, eyes never really closing. Around 2 in the morning, Daniel stirred and looked at me. "You know," he said, voice hoarse, "if I didn't make it, I'd be okay knowing you've got Luke now." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Don't talk like that," I whispered fiercely. "You're going to make it. You hear me? You're not leaving me. Not now. Not after everything." Luke stood, coming to the other side of the bed. "She's right. You're not done yet. And neither am I." Daniel's gaze shifted between us, and for a moment the room felt smaller, more solid, like the three of us were holding it together by sheer will. By dawn, his fever began to drop. The lab showed no sign of graft-versus-host disease, and the initial culture suggested a mild infection likely caught early. Antibiotics would handle it, Dr. Patel assured us. The relief was so sharp it almost hurt. I stepped into the hallway, leaning against the cool wall, closing my eyes as the adrenaline drained away. Luke joined me, leaning beside me in silence for a long minute. "You really love him," he said finally. I turned my head toward him. "He's my whole life." Luke nodded, his jaw set. "Then we'll make sure you keep him." And in that moment I believed him. By the second week after the fever scare, Daniel's recovery started to gather real momentum. The lab results showed steady increases in his counts, and his energy began to flicker back in a way that felt both thrilling and fragile, like watching a match catch flame in the wind. One morning, I came into the room to find him sitting in the armchair by the window instead of lying in bed. The sunlight caught in his hair, and for a moment, he almost looked like the man I used to see on the porch at home, coffee mug in hand. "Look at you," I said, smiling. "Rebelling against bed rest?" He grinned faintly. "Just stretching my legs. Feels good not to be flat on my back." Luke, who had arrived early with a bag of breakfast from the diner down the street, handed Daniel a paper cup. "Brought you the good coffee. Don't tell your nurse." Daniel inhaled the steam like it was oxygen. "You might just be my favorite brother." "Your only brother," Luke shot back with a smirk. Those small exchanges had become the rhythm of our days. Luke was no longer just the quiet figure in the visitor chair. He was part of the atmosphere here, bringing food, running errands, even fixing the stubborn lock on Daniel's bedside drawer with a screwdriver he'd somehow smuggled in. One afternoon while Daniel was napping, Luke asked me to take a walk with him outside. The early spring air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of rain-soaked concrete. We stopped under the awning near the side entrance, where the traffic noise faded to a low hum. "I've been thinking," Luke began, hands in the pockets of his jacket. "When Daniel gets out, he's going to need a lot of follow-up care. Checkups, immune monitoring, physical therapy, all of it. That's a lot for you to handle alone." I nodded slowly. "It's going to be a big adjustment." He looked at me directly. "So I want to help. Not just for a few days. I mean, I'd like to stick around for a while. Maybe even move closer. Nashville's only a couple hours from Pine Hollow, but if I'm here, I can actually be useful." The offer hit me in two ways at once. Gratitude for the extra support and a quiet realization that Daniel's life wasn't just mine anymore. It was tied to someone new, someone he'd been missing his whole life. "I think Daniel would like that," I said after a pause. "I know I would." Luke gave a small nod, almost as if he'd been holding his breath for my answer. "Good. Then I'll start figuring it out." That evening when Daniel woke up, Luke told him. I watched the expression on Daniel's face shift from surprise to something warmer, deeper relief, maybe. "You'd do that? Leave Pine Hollow?" Daniel asked. Luke shrugged. "What's a place compared to family?" Daniel didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and clasped Luke's forearm, holding it tightly in a way that didn't need translation. The days that followed carried a kind of lightness we hadn't felt in months. Daniel's steps grew steadier during his short walks down the hall. His appetite returned enough for him to joke about craving barbecue, and the nurses started to talk in terms of when he went home instead of if. And then, on the 14th day post-transplant, something happened that made me realize just how much Luke had already entwined himself into our lives. I came back from the cafeteria to find Daniel holding a small wrapped package. "Luke left this for you," he said, nodding toward the door. "Said it was for both of us, but you should open it." Inside the paper was a pocket knife, its handle smooth and worn, the initials HC carved into one side. "It was our father's," Daniel said quietly, running his thumb over the engraving. "Luke told me it's the only thing he's kept all these years. And now he wants us to have it." I stared at the knife, feeling the weight of it in my palm. It wasn't just a tool. It was a piece of history neither of them had known they shared until now. In that moment, I understood that Luke wasn't just visiting to help. He was anchoring himself to us piece by piece. And in some deep, unspoken way, we were doing the same to him. The day Daniel was discharged from the hospital felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel into blinding light. 2.5 weeks after the transplant, the medical team finally said the words I'd been desperate to hear. "He's stable enough to go home." It didn't come without conditions. There were strict instructions, masks in public, no visitors for the first month, daily temperature checks, a carefully timed medication schedule that could rival a military operation. But none of that mattered. The thought of bringing him back to our little wooden house on the edge of Nashville was enough to make my chest ache with relief. Luke insisted on driving behind us in his truck, just in case. Though I suspected it was his way of making sure this moment didn't pass without him being part of it. When we pulled into the driveway, I realized how long it had been since I'd seen our home in daylight without the shadow of fear hanging over it. The porch looked the same, weathered boards, the rocking chair Daniel made for me years ago still sitting in its usual spot, but stepping inside felt different. Fuller. Warmer. As though the walls knew what we'd been through and were ready to welcome us back. I guided Daniel to the couch, stacking pillows behind him while Luke brought in the bags from the hospital. "Feels strange being here," Daniel admitted, glancing around the living room like he was seeing it for the first time. "Strange good or strange bad?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Strange good. Like we've been gone for years. That first night home we kept things simple. Soup for dinner, a short walk around the backyard, and then Daniel settled into his favorite spot on the couch while Luke sat in the armchair across from him. I curled up beside Daniel, listening as the two of them talked, about Pine Hollow, about Luke's workshop, About the fishing trips they might take once Daniel's strength returned. It was easy conversation, the kind that stitches people together without them realizing it. Every so often, Daniel would glance at Luke with that same look I'd seen in the hospital, half wonder, half gratitude, as though he still couldn't quite believe his brother was real. Over the next few days, Luke slipped naturally into our routine. He handled errands so I could focus on Daniel's care, cooked breakfast when I was too tired, and even repaired the squeaky hinge on the back door without being asked. He didn't hover, but he was always there when we needed him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas started their hum, I stepped out onto the porch to find Luke sitting in the rocking chair. He was holding the pocket knife he'd given Daniel, turning it slowly in his hands. "You okay?" I asked, leaning against the door frame. He nodded, but there was a faraway look in his eyes. All of this, it's more than I thought I'd ever have. Family dinners, people who check if I've eaten, a reason to be somewhere other than my own head. I sat down in the chair beside him. "You've earned it. You didn't just give Daniel a second chance, you gave us both one." He gave a small smile, tucking the knife back into his pocket. "Guess we're all even now." Inside, Daniel called for us to join him, his voice carrying that familiar warmth I'd feared I might never hear again. As we stepped back into the house, I realized this wasn't the end of our story. It was the start of a new one. 3 people bound together not just by blood, but by the choice to show up for each other when it mattered most. And for the first time in months, I didn't just feel hope. I felt safe. 3 weeks after Daniel came home, the rhythm of our new life started to settle in. Not quite normal, but something close enough that I could breathe without bracing for the next crisis. Mornings began with coffee at the kitchen table, me measuring out Daniel's pills in the small plastic organizer, him teasing me about how seriously I guarded it. Luke would wander in a few minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, holding a newspaper he picked up from the corner store on his early walk. It became our quiet ritual. No TV, no rushing, just the 3 of us talking about small things before the day began. Daniel's strength was coming back in little bursts. He could walk the length of our backyard now without stopping to rest, and every time he did, I saw that proud spark in his eyes. The color had returned to his face, and his voice carried more weight than it had in months. It wasn't just his body that was healing. It was the light in him, the part that made our house feel alive. One crisp afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. Luke was in the garage working on a project, so I set the basket down and answered it. A woman stood on the porch, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a faded denim jacket. She was maybe in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a loose braid and eyes so similar to Luke's it made me pause. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "I'm looking for Luke Henderson. Is he here?" My instinct prickled. "Who's asking?" She hesitated before answering. "My name's Rebecca. I'm his sister." The words hit me like a slow-moving wave. I stepped back, unsure whether to call Luke or send her away. But before I could decide, Luke's voice came from behind me. "Rebecca." He'd come in through the side door, wiping his hands on a rag. When he saw her, he froze. "I didn't know where else to go," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard you were here, and I need to talk to you." Daniel had come to the doorway now, leaning lightly on the frame. His eyes flicked between them, confusion and curiosity etched across his face. "Come in," Luke said after a moment, his voice low but steady. Rebecca stepped inside, glancing at Daniel but not speaking. We all sat in the living room, the air thick with an unspoken tension. "I didn't know about you until a few years ago," she told Luke. "I was raised by Dad's sister after she left. I didn't even know I had brothers until an old neighbor mentioned it. But when I tried to find you, there was nothing. No address. No number." Luke leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "So why now?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Because I heard about the trouble back in Pine Hollow. And I thought, maybe you'd need someone in your corner." For a long moment, Luke didn't answer. Then he glanced at Daniel, as if silently asking what he should do. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "If she's family, we should hear her out." And just like that, I realized our little circle had the potential to grow again. But it also meant opening ourselves to new complications, new risks. Because family, especially the kind found late, had a way of rewriting everything you thought you knew. The silence after Rebecca's words hung heavy in the room. Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on Luke, while I studied Rebecca, wondering if she had any idea how carefully we had been building this fragile new life. Luke cleared his throat. "You heard right about Pine Hollow," he said, his voice even. "And yeah, it's been complicated. But why now, Rebecca? Why come find me after all these years?" She glanced down at her hands, twisting the frayed cuff of her jacket. "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't have family. When I found out about you, I told myself I'd wait until the right time. But there's never a right time for this kind of thing. And then I heard." She hesitated, looking at Daniel. "I heard you saved your brother's life. That you came here to help him when you could have stayed out of it. I thought maybe that meant you wouldn't shut the door on me." Luke leaned back, his eyes searching her face. "If I'm honest, I don't know what to do with you showing up right now." Daniel spoke before Rebecca could answer. "You do what you did with me. You let her in." His voice wasn't forceful, but there was a quiet conviction in it. "We've all been alone long enough." Luke's jaw tightened. He looked between me, Daniel, and Rebecca, and I could almost see the battle in his head. Finally, he sighed and nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "All right. Sit. Tell me what you've been doing all these years." As Rebecca started to talk, about being raised by their aunt, about the job she'd had, about the town she'd drifted through, I watched the way Daniel listened. He was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, as if every detail was a thread tying him more tightly to this newfound family. I realized then how much this journey had changed all of us. Weeks ago, Daniel had been fading in a hospital bed, convinced he was alone in the world. Luke had been tucked away in Pine Hollow, carrying the weight of a fractured past. And I had been bracing for the moment I might lose the man I loved. Now here we were, 3 siblings in one room, 2 of them only recently discovered, the third bound to both by choice and love. Later, after Rebecca had gone to a nearby motel for the night, I found Daniel and Luke sitting on the porch. The sun was setting, casting a warm, amber light across the yard. Luke held the old pocket knife in his hand, flipping it open and shut. "She's a part of us," Daniel said quietly. "Even if it's messy." Luke nodded. "Yeah, I guess it's time we stop running from what's ours." I stepped out to join them and Daniel reached for my hand. "You know," he said, "I thought getting the transplant was the miracle. But it's more than that. I got my life back, yeah. But I also got a family I didn't even know was out there." Luke looked at me then, his expression soft. "You're part of that too, Leona. You found me. You made this happen." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I just followed a thread of hope," I said. "You two did the rest." We sat there until the fireflies came out, the quiet between us no longer heavy but full of everything we'd gained, and everything we still had to learn about each other. And I knew this was how our story should end. Not in the shadow of a hospital room, but here on this porch with the people we loved beside us. Because sometimes, life gives you exactly what you need just when you're about to lose hope. And if you're lucky, it gives you even more than you dared to ask for. Family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the one you fight for, the one you choose, and the one that shows up when you least expect it. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Echoes, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and tell us in the comments what family means to you.